Robert Durst. Mr. Durst is present with his lawyers, Mr. Chesnoff, and Mr. DeGuerin, and Mr. Lewis, Mr. Lewin, Mr. Lydia, Mr. Miata, representing the people. You may resume your cross-examination.
Thank you. Mr. Durst, do you recall that yesterday, when we adjourned, I had just played for you a jail call, a conversation with your wife, where you were discussing the fact that you were practicing your testimony. Do you recall that jail call that I played for you?
Yes.
Would you agree that at the very least, what you were doing, if somebody found out about it, could appear to be incriminating?
No.
In fact, Mr. Durst, you actually said when your wife pointed out that there was a risk, you responded, a risk, but leaving out the risk, and then you continued. Do you recall saying that?
No.
In fact, isn't that the reason, Mr. Durst, why you actually asked Stuart Altman later if he had destroyed the tapes?
No.
Do you agree that you asked Stuart Altman to destroy the tapes?
Stuart Altman suggested that he send the tapes to Debbie to be destroyed. I said, you destroy them.
And is it your position that you were not asking Stuart if they had been destroyed?
No, I was asking him.
Well, why were you asking him about whether or not the tapes had been destroyed if you didn't care whether or not they were destroyed?
I wanted to know if they were destroyed.
For what reason?
Well, I can think of it that I wanted them destroyed, and I wanted to know if they were destroyed.
You agree that you also practiced for your presentation, for your testimony in Galveston with your jury consultant, Robert Hirshhorn, correct?
Correct.
And isn't it true that you practiced going over... Mr. Durst has already related...
We need to get...
Mr. Durst, isn't it true that you practiced going over and explaining every step of the killing and the dismemberment that you were going to testify about with Robert Hirshhorn, the jury consultant?
I spent a lot of time with Robert Hirshhorn, whether I went over every step of the question.
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that you spent not only just a lot of time with Mr. Hirshhorn, but a lot of time with Mr. Hirshhorn practicing your testimony, correct?
Went over, spent a lot of time with Mr. Hirshhorn, telling him what happened.
Well, Mr. Durst, haven't you previously stated, isn't it your words that you have said in the past, that you spent time with Robert Hirshhorn, your jury consultant, not just going over what happened, but practicing your testimony, correct?
Practice for the direct examination.
Well, you can't practice cross-examination, Mr. Durst, because you don't know what's going to be asked, correct?
We did. Sure you can. You can guess what's going to be asked.
So it's your testimony that you did not do any practice at all regarding probable areas of cross-examination of your testimony in Galveston?
No. We practice for the direct examination.
Well, if you're going to practice for the direct examination, Mr. Durst, can you explain why you weren't practicing for the cross?
I guess when you practice for one of them, you practice for the other.
Would you agree that in Galveston, that the prosecution did not vigorously cross-examine you regarding either the killing or the dismemberment?
No,
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that in my cross-examination, I have gone into far greater detail than the prosecutors did in Galveston?
no.
All right. You have previously discussed the reasons why you believe that you were acquitted in Galveston, and you discussed this in particular with Andrew Jarecki and also during your interview in 2015 with myself and detectives, correct?
My interview with Jarecki, I did just exactly as Andrew said I should do when I talked about the trial. My interview with you, I was hoping to do a plea bargain with you.
Isn't it true, Mr. Durst, that during your interview with me, starting at page 93, line 16, to page 94, line 14, that you said that there were 6 reasons, originally you said 6 reasons why you were acquitted in Galveston. Is that correct?
I don't remember the number 6.
In fact, Mr. Durst, you said there were 6, but then you only gave 5. Do you remember that?
I remember being asked by both Andrew and you why I was acquitted. And I remember saying that I had the 3 best lawyers in the courtroom. Was one reason. I think another reason was I felt that the prosecution thought that I would go bananas attempting to describe the dismemberment. Let me see, what I don't know that I remember what the other reasons were.
Do you recall saying that Cody Caslis, the lead detective in the case,
Right, that was
turned the
one of
jury
them.
off?
That was one of them, but the arresting officer, Cody Gonzalez, turned everybody off with his ridiculous theories.
Do you remember that you also said you called one of the prosecutors, you said he was a mumbler?
Yes, the assistant prosecutor, Joel something or other,
Do you recall,
was not very competent.
do you recall stating that the jury, quote, believed me, or if they didn't believe everything that I said, Sistrunk, who was the lead prosecutor, had turned most of it over to Joel, the mumbler, or whatever his name is, and he did a terrible, 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 terrible job, unquote. Do you remember that being a reason?
I remember that as a quote that Andrew asked me to say.
Well,
Whether he did a terrible job, I don't think he did a terrible job. I don't think he did a good job, but not a terrible job.
so you remembered the quote that Andrew allegedly had you say 5 years before, and then you repeated it during your interview with me? Is that correct?
I repeated to you what I had told him, what Andrew had told me to say, and which I had said.
And you remembered that from 5 years earlier?
I don't know that I remember. Right now, sitting here, the only reasons I come up with were that I had the 3 best lawyers in the courtroom, that Cody Gonzalez, the arresting detective, turned everybody off, that the assistant DA, Joel something or other, did not do a good job. I don't remember what the others were.
Mr. Durst, there's one reason that you did not give for your acquittal. Do you know what that reason that I'm referring to is?
Yeah, of course I do, and I know you've made a fuss about it. I did not say I was innocent.
Well, Mr. Durst, so if you're explaining why it is you were acquitted, wouldn't you expect that the first thing you would say is, hey, listen, I was acquitted because I didn't do it. I was acquitted because I wasn't guilty. I was acquitted because I was falsely charged. You never mentioned anything even remotely close to that, did you?
Excuse me. Objection, argument,
Overruled.
and relevant.
Overruled.
I had described what happened. I didn't think it was necessary to repeat that I was innocent. Obviously, I was innocent.
So, Mr. Durst, you would agree you gave 5 different reasons why you had been acquitted in Galveston, and none of them actually involved your actual innocence, correct?
Well, so far, I've only been able to remember 3 of them.
But I refreshed you with 2 more, and you did not disagree that you had said them, correct?
I did not say again that I was innocent.
You also credited your jury consultant, didn't you, with respect to your acquittal? Is that correct?
He did a great job.
I want to play RD 381, 315-15, page 27, lines 18 through 25.
Part of People's 291.
Thank you, 291.
Bob, how much of what you did on the stand was you, and how much of it was them kind of helping? In other words, did you do that all yourself? That was brilliant. I mean, I got to tell you, it was brilliant.
No, I mean, I went over what happened repeatedly.
Right.
And the jury consultant, Robert Hirschman,
You credited Robert Hirschman for basically helping you to sway the jury with your presentation, correct?
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
I don't think Robert Hirschhorn was that involved with my testimony. The job of a jury consultant is to get good jurors.
Right, are you aware of a job of a jury consultant being to sit down with a defendant and go over their testimony?
What I remember is what's up on the screen. No, I mean I went over what happened repeatedly.
Mr. Durst, when you're going over what happened with him repeatedly in preparation for your testimony, you already have a jury seated, correct?
As soon as the jury was seated, the trial commenced. I think I went over it prior to having a jury seated.
Right, I want to talk about the reinvestigation by LAPD Robbery Homicide Division and the LA County District Attorney's Office in 2013. When did you first find out about it?
I believe it was on October 31st, 1981.
No, I'm not asking you about the investigation into reinvestigation into Kathy. I'm asking, you're now aware that the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, the LAPD, started reinvestigating Susan Berman's murder in early 2013. That has been the testimony. My question to you is, when did you find out that we were reinvestigating that case?
Susan Berman was murdered September 23rd, rather December 23rd of 2000. Obviously, the investigation started immediately when the body was found.
Mr. Durst, there's been testimony in this case that cold case detectives and myself began reinvestigating this case in very late 2012 or very early 2013. You've heard this testimony, correct?
I don't remember hearing such testimony.
You are aware, Mr. Durst.
I guess I do. I guess I do. I went, trying to remember which witness it was, but somebody said that Andrew had contacted you after my interview with him in 2012.
So the question I have for you, though, is you would agree that the first time you realized that there was a reinvestigation into Susan Berman was when you got arrested in March of 2015, correct?
I'm having difficulty with investigation and reinvestigation. I did not think that the LAPD had ever stopped investigating Susan's murder.
Haven't you previously said, Mr. Durst, that had you known that there was a reinvestigation going on, that you would have probably taken off for Cuba?
Sounds like something I would say to you.
RD 346, 315-15, page 65, lines 1 through 3.
It's part of People's 291.
Sorry, Your Honor, I think having a technical issue.
That's okay, I'll just read it. Mr. Durst, would you agree, one moment? Do you recall being asked during the interview question, and I was concerned if you found out that I was looking at this case, and you respond, yeah, I would have backed off and gone to Cuba, or whatever it is. You agree that's what you said?
To you?
Yes.
Sure.
And Mr. Durst, why were you going to flee to Cuba if you had no involvement in Susan's murder?
I did not say I was going to flee to Cuba.
Well, Mr. Durst, when you were arrested with the gun, the mask, and all of the money, where exactly were you going?
I had gotten there. I was going to New Orleans.
And you were just going to stay in New Orleans in the hotel with your gun, your mask, and your money?
I was going to stay in New Orleans with the gun and the mask. And I think it was $40-some-odd thousand. But I was going to rent an apartment.
Mr. Durst, are you forgetting that during the interview you admitted that you were going to be fleeing and mentioned Cuba? Did you forget that you've already said that?
When are you saying I said that?
During the March 15, 2015 interview.
With you?
Correct.
I had forgotten I said that.
Okay, well, now that you remember you said that, are you going to take ownership of it, or is that going to be one of those things that you said only to get a plea?
Objection, argument overruled.
I will take ownership of it, but I was never intending to go to Cuba. I had visited Cuba in 2010 on some group. At that time in 2015, there was no such thing as a flight to Cuba.
All right.
You had to go on some kind of a group.
All right, let's talk about the New Orleans interview that you had with myself and detectives in a little more detail. You agree that was completely voluntary on your part, correct?
Completely voluntary.
You were read your rights, correct?
Correct.
No one forced you to speak, correct?
Correct.
Why did you decide to speak to myself and investigators?
You want to hear this for the 15th time, that I thought I was going to try to get you to get me out of the nightmare prison system in Louisiana and take me to Los Angeles. And I was willing to do more or less any vaguely reasonable plea agreement to accomplish that.
But that's what you said at trial, but do you recall, Mr. Durst, I asked you that question towards the beginning of the interview. RD 004, 315-15, page 15, lines 2 through 5.
Part of People's 291.
Do you want me to tell you a little bit about what I do and who I am?
I can do whatever you want to talk to me about. It's more pleasant in here than out there.
That's why you said you wanted to talk to me, Mr. Durst, because basically it was more pleasant to talk, correct?
We were in a warmer room than the cell where I had been in all night long naked. And you gave me coffee.
So, Mr. Durst, would you agree that one of the reasons that you wanted to talk was because, in essence, your favorite subject to talk about is Bob Durst, correct?
Overruled.
I had no desire to be in jail, no desire to talk to you about Bob Durst.
Well, you agree you spent a long time talking to me about Bob Durst, correct?
We're going to end up with the same conversation. Where I am saying that I had read about the Louisiana prison system, and my small experience with it was that it was a nightmare that it was known to be. Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola is known as...
Motion to strike at this point is non-responsive.
Stricken.
Mr. Durst, you would agree that the interview that you had with me, for whatever reason you decided to have it, you said things that were very damaging to your case, correct?
I would agree that just now you got the judge to tell me to shut up because you did not want to hear my answer to your question.
Motion to strike is non-responsive.
Stricken.
So, Mr. Durst, you would agree that the interview that you had with me was very damaging to your case, correct?
Am I going to be allowed to answer this question?
The question I just asked, you can answer. It does not involve the prison conditions at Angola or anything else about prison or being naked in a cell.
It has everything to do with the penitentiary in Angola.
Motion to strike is non-responsive.
Just a moment.
Question I asked, you answer. The interview was very damaging. No, it is not responsive, it's stricken.
Again, Mr. Durst, listen to my question. Do you agree that the interview that you had in Louisiana with myself and detectives was very damaging to your case?
No,
Do you agree that at numerous times during the interview that you were willing to answer many of my questions?
I thought I answered most of your questions.
You would agree, though, that in the face of direct accusations about the killing of Susan, the killing of Kathy, that although you did not deny them, you would instead respond with answers such as, quote, I'm not going to go there, or I'm going to stay away from that, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Durst, you agree that in saying, I'm going to stay away from killing Susan Berman, that's not denying that you did it, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Durst, you would agree that you certainly at that point could have said, hey, listen, I didn't kill her, correct?
I could have, but I don't think that would have accomplished anything.
Now, during the New Orleans interview, at one point in time, you brought up the idea that you could, quote, go through what you did with Kathy, and I think you want me to go through details of Susan and say, okay, so now what would I ask for? Unquote. That's what you said, correct?
Yes, that was my final and last attempt to do a plea bargain with you.
When you say it was your last...
I went right up to the edge of the lake. All you had to do was push me in with your finger, and I would have made any deal possible.
Well, you agree, Mr. Durst, that your quote, trying to get a plea deal, did not happen until approximately the last 20 minutes of the interview. That's the first time you brought the subject up, correct?
No, I brought it up when you gave me the opportunity to bring it up.
So you're saying, Mr. Durst, that I did not allow you to speak for the first roughly 2.5 hours? Is that your testimony?
I'm saying that I brought up specifically, I want to make a deal when it seemed to me the appropriate time to say, hey, I want to make a deal.
In fact, Mr. Durst, didn't you follow up what I just asked you by saying, quote, if I tell you these things, I'm pleading guilty. I'm going to be going back to Los Angeles and doing my time, unquote. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Durst, tell me how that is not a confession to Susan Berman's murder.
Argumentative objection.
Overruled.
It's not a confession. I did not say I killed Susan Berman.
I want to play RD 538, 315-15, page 104, line 11, to page 105, line 21.
Articles 291.
Okay.
I would like to talk to you when you come back in court today. That's going to be up to you what you do. I don't know whether there'll be a lawyer there today. I don't know what that lawyer is going to tell you.
If he's gonna tell me to shut my mouth, of course.
Well, and this one I'll tell you, you have every right to listen to your lawyer and to do what your lawyer says. I think you know that you've already told me, you've talked enough. I have enough now. What I want to talk about when we get back is I want to find out what is it that we can discuss where I can get the truth about some of the things that you've said you couldn't really answer for me. But you have told me, correct, that there is, you know what I want, correct?
Yes, you'd like some details from me if I knew
Yes.
about where Kathy's body is.
And about what happened to Susan. Those,
And about what happened to
okay,
Susan.
and you would agree that you're in the position, if you want, to tell me more than you have
Not
so far.
about that, I'm not about to go that far.
Okay.
But
But wait a minute, what you're telling me though, that I want to understand when you're saying, tell me what,
well, you asked me
I can
what I
do.
thought you wanted to hear. I think what you wanted to hear to make Ann McCormack happy is, what did you do with Kathy?
Right,
And I think you want me to go through details of Susan.
I do.
Okay, so now, what would I ask for?
Tell me,
If I tell you those things, I'm pleading guilty.
okay?
And I'm pleading guilty, I'm gonna be going back to Los Angeles, to California, and doing my time.
That's what you said, correct, Mr. Durst?
Correct.
And you would agree, Mr. Durst, that you were proposing that if you tell us what you did with Kathy and what actually happened with Susan, what would I be able to do for you? Is that correct?
Correct.
Mr. Durst, how could you tell us what you did with Kathy if you didn't kill her and dispose of her body?
I wouldn't have been able to.
And how could you go through the details of Susan if you were not the person who murdered her?
I would not have been able to go into the details of Susan.
So your position is you are saying all this to get a plea bargain, correct?
Correct.
And you understand, Mr. Durst, that in a plea bargain, what you would have to do is, in the end, for you to get anything, you would have to be able to give us the two things that you said you could give us. You would tell us what happened to Kathy, where her body was, and you would tell us what actually happened with Susan. But
If I,
Wait a minute, object upon the question. Two things you said you could kill Susan. That's not what the record said.
I have,
Overruled. That's overruled.
so if I could, I hadn't finished my question, now I have to start over. Could the court ask Mr. DeGuerin, Your Honor, to wait until I finish my question?
Yes, wait until the question's over.
So, Mr. Durst, you are now saying that the point of that was you're trying to get a plea deal, correct?
Correct.
And a plea deal, the point of a plea deal is that in the end, in order for your plea deal to go through, you have to give us what you're offering on your end, and we have to give you what you're requesting on our end. Is that correct?
Objection, statement.
Overruled.
Not
Overruled.
statement of the law.
Overruled.
I never said I knew what happened to Susan. I never said I knew where Kathy was buried.
What you said, Mr. Durst, is that you were trying to get a plea deal. And you were trying to get a plea deal by telling us that you could tell us what happened to Kathy, where her body was, and you could tell us what actually happened with Susan, correct?
I would have been willing to agree to tell you anything. I would have been willing to agree to tell you who shot Jack Kennedy,
I don't think you did that one.
who shot John Lennon.
Yes. Mr. Durst, in the end, how is it that you're going to be able to, quote, get a plea deal when you are now stating, well, I'm telling you what I'm going to give you, but in the end, I don't have the information to give it to you? That means, Mr. Durst, you weren't looking for a plea deal because you're saying I didn't have the information. Explain that.
Objection, argument.
Overruled.
I did not have the information. I would not have been able to follow through on what I had said you wanted to hear.
Then, Mr. Durst, then in the end, you know that you're not getting any plea deal, so what's the point?
I don't know that I'm not getting a plea deal.
So you believe, Mr. Durst, that you're going to make a plea deal by saying, I'm going to tell you where Kathy is and what I did to her, and I'm going to tell you how I murdered Susan. But I don't actually know that. But in the end, you'll still give me the plea deal, even though I'm not going to give you my part of the deal. How on earth would that ever work?
I have seen it work.
You have... please explain that.
I had a cellmate in Pennsylvania.
Danny Cunningham, or what's this guy's name?
Mr. Lewin, don't do that. Don't mock the witness.
I'm trying to answer your question.
Go ahead, I'm listening.
I had a cellmate in Pennsylvania who, after I left and went to Galveston, told the authorities in Pennsylvania that I had told him that I had shot Morris Black after he came back from the library. And he was able to use that to get transported to Galveston to testify at my trial.
Well, Mr. Durst, the problem with what you're saying is that there's nobody else involved. You are simply saying, I'm going to make the following deal. I'm going to tell you what I did with Kathy, where her body is. I'm going to tell you how I murdered Susan, and in response, you're going to give me what I want. However, you're now saying that in the end, you could never even enter into a plea agreement because you didn't possess that information. So the question I have for you, Mr. Durst, is how does it make sense that you're pursuing a plea agreement that has no possibility ever being completed because you're denying having the information?
I thought that by leading you up to the brink, I'd be able to get back to Los Angeles and hoe and hum for a good while before you found out that I have no idea what happened to Kathy, and I have no idea what happened with Susan Berman.
By the way, Mr. Durst, I just asked you an incredibly complex question. Would you agree? Very long. The last question I asked you, was it very long?
No, I don't think it was very long.
Did you notice, Mr. Durst, that the whole time I was asking you the question, you were looking directly at me? You did not look down at your monitor, and you answered instantly without reviewing what was on the monitor. Did you realize that you did that?
It was 7 lines. Many, 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 many of your questions have gone for more than 7 lines.
I didn't say it was my record
When
question.
I can hear you, I don't need to look at my monitor because I can answer your question. I mostly look at my monitor when I cannot hear you.
All right, so I want to continue, Mr. Durst. 1 second here. Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that even though you are saying that they're not true, so you're saying, hey, I told you that I could tell you what happened to Kathy, where I put her body, I told you I could tell you how I murdered Susan, but in the end, I wasn't going to be able to do that. But you would agree that in making those statements, that if the things coming out of your mouth were true, they would be confessions. Agreed?
What came out of my mouth was qualified. I said, you would want me to tell you what happened with Susan Berman and what happened with Kathy Durst.
Mr. Durst, isn't it true that during that interview, you became concerned as the interview progressed? You got worried and nervous, and you actually started to think about, for a brief period of time, how you were going to spend your remaining years, and that you slipped up and actually told the truth when you said that you had the information to give about what happened to Kathy, what you had done with her body, and how you had murdered Susan Berman?
Objection. Argumentative, mistakes of record.
I did not slip up. I told you that I knew what you wanted to hear. And I thought, you keep saying, in the end. Well, in the end might have been years later before I was put to the question to come up with what I was supposed to say on my end of the deal.
So what you're basically saying is your argument is basically, I'm a liar and I was going to continue to lie, and that I don't know when you would have actually caught up with my lies. That's basically what you've just said, correct?
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
Yes, I thought I could drag you on for quite a while, and while I was dragging you on, I would be in a California state system, which is known for being very humanitarian.
Mr. Durst, your attorney said during opening statements that during the New Orleans interview you were, quote, playing me. Can you explain, is that your position of what was going on?
Yes.
And when you say, you've now testified that actually you were trying to get a plea deal, that was your trial testimony, and now you're agreeing that no, actually what you were doing was you were playing me. Can you explain what that means?
Somehow playing you and trying to get a plea deal sounds like the same thing to me.
Well, would you agree that Mr. Durst, that playing somebody has the inference that you are not actually dealing in good faith, correct?
Sure.
And Mr. Durst, isn't what's really going on here, throughout all your testimony, is you keep getting caught in lies and inconsistencies, and that in response, you end up simply stating more lies and inconsistencies.
No.
All right. Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that in your jail calls, which have been monitored, that almost never, when you have discussed with anybody the situation with Susan or Kathy, have you actually denied having killed them? Would you agree?
Well, I certainly don't remember every jail call, but my jail calls are all with individuals I believe to be my friends, who I had spoken to repeatedly in the past.
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that as an example, on December 23rd, 2020, this would have been right before, this would have been after the adjournment of the case in March, and about 5 months before we restarted the trial, that you had a conversation with Susie Giordano where you said, quote, "I've been getting more and more optimistic about my trial as I go over all of this stuff. It's going to be much more difficult for John Lewin to convince 12 people that I did all those things." Do you recall saying that?
Sure.
Mr. Durst, I want you to assume that in that call you did not say or add the information such as, well, John Lewin's not going to be able to convince them that I did those things because I didn't do them, or I didn't kill Susan or Kathy. You focus, correct, Mr. Durst, simply on the idea, not that you didn't commit these crimes, but that you didn't think there was going to be enough evidence to actually get you convicted, correct?
Objection 352, 765.
So,
765 is not applicable. 352 is overruled.
Susie Giordano and I talked about things that went on in my life and in her life many, 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 many times. Telling Susie Giordano that I'm innocent would have been enormously redundant.
well, Mr. Durst, are you aware in the calls that you had with her, can you point to one call where you said, the hundreds of calls you've had with her, "Hey, Susie, I'm innocent, I didn't do this"? Can you point to one call?
I can't, I don't remember what I said on the call, but I never felt I needed to say to Susie Giordano, I'm innocent.
So you would agree, Mr. Durst, that to the best of your memory, despite the probably hundreds of calls you've had with Susie Giordano, that you cannot recall ever having said to her, "Hey, Susie, I'm innocent,"
I
correct?
don't recall ever not saying I was innocent. She knew I was innocent. We had talked repeatedly.
Well, you said that she knew you were innocent, but you've also now testified that 5 years ago, while you were in custody in New Orleans, shortly after your arrest, you admitted to her that you had written the cadaver note, correct?
You're asking me when I told Susie that I had written the cadaver note?
No, you've testified already that you told Susie that you wrote the cadaver note shortly after your arrest in New Orleans in 2015. That's your testimony, correct?
I don't recall.
You don't recall having said, I believe it was last Thursday, that in fact, you told Susie Giordano about the cadaver note, and you told her about that cadaver note shortly after your arrest in New Orleans. You don't remember having testified to that?
I don't remember telling Susie Giordano shortly after my arrest in New Orleans that I had written the cadaver note.
Do you remember ever telling Susie Giordano that you'd written the cadaver note?
Certainly not in a jail call.
No, that's not what I asked you. do you remember ever having told Susie Giordano,
Oh, I think I probably did tell Susie Giordano that the cadaver note was going to be a problem because it's in my handwriting and I wrote it. But I can't imagine that I would have said something like that in a jail call.
I didn't ask you said in a jail call, I'm trying to establish, you're saying right now, I just want to be clear, previously you testified, I told Susie Giordano about the cadaver note shortly after my arrest in New Orleans. That is correct, is that right?
I told Susie Giordano that the cadaver note was going to be a big problem for me long before my arrest.
Oh, so when did you first tell Susie Giordano the cadaver note was going to be a problem for you?
Would have been way, way before then. Probably I guess it was probably after Andrew confronted me with my handwriting and the cadaver note.
And when you told her it was going to be a problem for you, Mr. Durst, you previously testified that you had told her, correct, that you had written the cadaver note and had found Susan Berman's body, correct?
Correct.
So, Mr. Durst, if you had told Susie Giordano that you had written the cadaver note and found the body years ago, then would your statement that you just said a moment ago, I don't need to tell Susie Giordano that I didn't kill Susan because she knows, well, how would she know when you're telling her you wrote the cadaver note, found Susan's body, and that you have previously stated repeatedly a note that only the killer could have written? How does any of that make sense?
A note only the killer could have written is a quote from Andrew.
And a quote that you repeated when I interviewed you 5 years later.
I've repeated it many times.
All right. Let's talk about Nick Chavin for a moment. You've agreed that at the time Kathy disappeared, Nick Chavin was one of your best friends, correct?
Correct.
You've heard each of the interviews that Nick had with myself, Mr. Bailey, and investigators. Agreed?
I did not hear your interviews.
Well, Mr. Durst, most of those interviews were played during Nick Chavin's conditional examination testimony, which you heard live, and then you heard it when we played it before the jury at trial, correct?
Correct.
So it's the testimony and interviews are different times. So he's just testified that he didn't hear the interviews, and you've just described the testimony. So you'll need to
All
clarify.
right. Mr. Durst, during the Mr. Chavin's conditional examination testimony, the interviews that took place before were played as a part of the conditional examination. Do you recall that?
Correct.
And do you recall Mr. Chavin repeatedly, Mr. Durst, being reluctant when we first started interviewing him to say anything incriminating about you?
I recall that Nick Chavin repeatedly changed his story.
Well, Mr. Durst, you would agree that he changed his story from trying to protect you and saying he didn't know anything to eventually saying, you know what, I've got to say what Bob Durst told me he did to our close friend Susan Berman, correct?
I heard Nick Chavin tell his story probably a dozen different times, and each time the story was different.
Mr. Durst, you agree you were very concerned about Nick Chavin's testimony correct?
I was very concerned when.
You were very concerned about Nick Chavin's testimony while you were in custody. What's he going to end up saying at trial, correct?
Are we talking about this trial?
Yes.
I don't believe I was very concerned until he came out with his last story.
SG 076 4716 849 jail call with Susan Giordano.
This will be a new exhibit, this will be People's 338.
338 and 338A.
What's the date?
I called Nick, I didn't get an answer. It was the first time that I've been in jail and called him. Up until now, Cass has been doing it. Very, very nervous. You know, that he won't. What he should do is, if the message, if the call came from the jail, it doesn't say it's from me, but he'll get a message that somebody called from his phone number.
What did you mean, Mr. Durst, about being, quote, very, very nervous?
No idea.
Kat, by the way, is Kat Bain, who is one of your lawyers that works with Mr. DeGuerin, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Durst, isn't it true that you were terrified at this point that Nick Chavin was cooperating and that he was going to be your undoing, correct?
Certainly not terrified, because I knew that Nick Chavin had changed his story so many times that he could not possibly be a credible witness.
Same call, SG 077.
New exhibit?
People's 339, 339A.
Thank you.
But Nick's calling you and telling you what?
That he just wanted me to meet with him and wanted to know why everybody wants to speak to him. He just is a nervous, crazy person.
Wait. He wants to know what?
Why everyone wants to meet with him.
Why the lawyers want to meet with him.
Yeah.
Have you tried asking the lawyers?
No, because that would make sense.
Anyway, it makes me very nervous, waiting to find out what the attitude is going to be about this whole thing.
I'll tell you, 100% positive.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm telling you that he is 100% in your corner.
Boy, that's good. You're sure, really.
I am really, really sure.
That makes my night. It really does.
Now, Mr. Durst, the lawyers that you're referring to are your lawyers, correct?
Correct.
And it made your night because at that point you were terrified that Nick was going to relay the confession about Susan that you'd made to him after your dinner, correct?
We would have to leave out the word terrified. And in jail, it does not take very much to make one's night.
Mr. Durst, you would agree that at this point in time, Nick Chavin has not testified yet, correct?
Correct.
And at this point in time, he is not returning the calls from your lawyers, correct? That's what you're being told.
I told my lawyers to leave him alone. That all Nick wanted was attention. The more attention you give him, the more he would want attention.
And Mr. Durst, when you're saying that it makes me very nervous waiting to find out what Nick's attitude is going to be about this whole thing, what that actually means is you're terrified that Nick is going to relate the fact that you confessed murder to him, correct?
Wrong.
And in fact, when Susie Giordano tells you wrongly that he is 100% in your corner, you respond, "You're really," and then you say, "That makes my night." That really does, after she says, "I'm really sure," correct?
I think we have just impeached Susie Giordano. Oh, I forgot the question. What are you asking me now?
So, Mr. Durst, you are sitting in this call with Susie Giordano, and she is telling you, "Don't worry, Bob, Nick's 100% on your side. I'm positive," correct? That's what she's telling you.
I think she was telling me that because Nick had told her that.
Motion to strike is non-responsive.
Stricken.
Every time I come up with an answer that you don't like, you get the judge to strike it.
It's interesting you use the term "come up with an answer." Not answer, but come up with an answer. I'm just curious, why do you use the term "come up with an answer," which you would agree implies that it's not a true answer, it's something you're making up on the spot? What does it mean?
Overruled.
It's my way I talk. It takes
Meaning
me a
lying?
while to think of what I want to say to you, and then when I come up with my answer, you ask the judge to tell the jury to ignore it.
So, Mr. Durst, listen to my question. Isn't it true that Susie Giordano is telling you that she's 100% sure Nick is in your corner?
She was telling me what Nick had told her.
Motion to strike is non-responsive.
Stricken.
Listen to my question.
It's not responsive. It's 100% responsive.
So listen to my question, Mr. Durst. I'm not asking you what Nick said to her. I'm saying, isn't it true? Susie Giordano said to you, referring to Nick, he's 100% in your corner, correct?
She said, I know he's 100% in your corner because he's told me he's in your corner.
And Mr. Durst, your response to hearing that was, you expressed some skepticism and basically said, are you really sure, correct?
Correct.
And then when she said, I'm really sure, you respond, that makes my night. It really does, correct?
Correct.
And your point is, no, it doesn't really make my night. That's just, anything makes my night because I'm in jail. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'll repeat that. It doesn't take much to make my night when I'm in jail.
Well, it certainly made your night, correct, when the person you confessed murder to, you're being told, don't worry, he's 100% in your corner, correct?
Well, the facts are wrong because I had not confessed anything to Nick Chavin.
Mr. Durst, you're aware that at the time you're having this conversation with Susie Giordano, that not only had you not been given Nick Chavin's statements, but your attorneys had not been given any of Nick Chavin's statements either, correct? You're aware of that?
Correct.
Nobody on your side knew whether Nick had talked to us or what he had said if he had talked to us, correct?
Correct.
And you were dying to know what Nick had said, correct?
Susie told me what he said.
And you, in fact, had Susie Giordano out there trying to find out what Nick had said, correct?
Susie Giordano told me what Nick had said.
After this call from Susie Giordano, the next day, you called Nick from the New Orleans jail, correct?
Don't recall.
NC 210 4816 2041 jail call. Before you play that, Mr. Durst, well, we'll have to play it and I'll go back. You're saying you don't remember, so let's play it first.
Your Honor, this is part of 281. The transcript can be found at 281F.
281.
I figure it was about a year ago actually 2 years ago. I've been in here a year, and I figured it was about a year before that my good friend Andrew Jarecki sent me to prison that we had dinner.
Yeah, I think it was about a year ago. That bastard Jarecki, you remember I told you not to do it. You remember I told you, right?
Unbelievable. How
You can
stupid
stop it.
I don't want to be in it.
Mr. Durst, does that now refresh your memory about having had a conversation with Nick Chavin on April 8, 2016?
If that's when that occurred, that's when it occurred.
I want you to assume for a moment, Mr. Durst, that that call occurred on April 8, 2016. I want you to further assume, Mr. Durst, that that is the first time that you had made any call to Nick Chavin from jail. Do you understand what I've asked you to assume for a moment?
I'm not aware that that was my first call to Nick Chavin.
So that's why I'm having you assume. I want you to assume, Mr. Durst,
Oh, I'm assuming that.
that was your first call to Nick Chavin. I want you to further assume, Mr. Durst, that very shortly into the call, not having spoken to Nick Chavin in approximately 2 years, that you brought up immediately the dinner that you had with Nick. You heard that, correct? You say as follows: I figure it was about a year ago, actually 2 years ago, I've been in here a year, and I figured it was about a year before that my good friend Andrew Jarecki sent me to prison that we had dinner. Do you recall that?
Now, what's the question again?
You brought up the dinner that you had with Nick, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Durst, the dinner you're referring to is the December 2014 dinner that Nick Chavin has testified where you confessed, correct?
One of Nick Chavin's testimonies was that I confessed to him at that dinner. But there was nothing to talk about, because I hadn't had dinner with him for probably 15 or 20 years prior to having dinner in 2014.
Right, so Mr. Durst, so the question is you agree that you bring up the dinner that you had with Nick during this call, correct?
It was the only thing I could refer to, because I hadn't even spoken to him in the last 20 years.
Well, Mr. Durst, what would make you so quickly into a call bring up a dinner where you're saying nothing actually happened?
There'd be nothing else for me to bring up with Nick Chavin, since I hadn't spoken to him in 20 years.
Well, would you agree, Mr. Durst, that alternative explanation for that could be that you're bringing up the dinner with Nick Chavin very early in the conversation because you know that you confessed to him during that dinner and you are trying to figure out where Nick stands and what he's going to do. Would you agree?
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
I would not agree.
Well, I want to be clear. First of all, you are in no way disputing Nick Chavin's testimony that you had dinner with him that night, correct?
I am willing to confirm that we had dinner.
And Susie Giordano has also testified, and she made a comment during her testimony that she spoke to you and Nick Chavin while you were still at the dinner table. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I don't know how she possibly could have done that.
Well, even if it was true, you would agree, Mr. Durst, that Nick Chavin's testimony is that the confession happened after dinner when you had already left the restaurant, correct? That's what he testified to.
Yeah,
So your testimony is Susie Giordano is not even being truthful about having spoken to you and Nick during that dinner. Is that correct?
Susie Giordano exaggerates things and makes many mistakes.
So-
I don't remember talking to her at dinner.
So,
One of us would have had to call her.
so you would agree, Mr. Durst, that this conversation where you are bringing up the dinner, that it is the same dinner where Nick Chavin is alleging you confessed to him, correct?
Correct.
And your position is that the reason you're bringing up this dinner is not because you're worried about the confession, it's because there was nothing else that you could talk about with Nick other than this dinner. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you're not disputing that you brought up this dinner within 40 seconds of the call, not having spoken to Nick Chavin at all since that dinner. You don't dispute that, correct?
If this occurred 40 seconds into the call, then I would not dispute it.
So,
I don't think the call lasted very long.
and you would agree that Nick Chavin, during his testimony, he said that you had confessed to him about Susan after dinner. Is that correct?
Correct.
And by the way, did he specifically testify that you told him, I murdered Susan, or did he instead say to you, testify that you told him it was either her or me, I had no choice?
We had no conversation after dinner. He left the restaurant before I did because I was opening up my
Motion to
walk.
strike is non-responsive.
Oh, I'll strike it.
Mr. Durst, listen to my
Oh,
question.
here it is again. You don't like my answer, so I'm not allowed to give you my answer.
Mr. Durst, listen to my question. You seem like you're getting angry. So, listen to my question, Mr. Durst.
Is that a question?
Well, I am.
You can ask him if he's
Mr.
getting...
Durst, are you getting
I
angry?
am getting angry. This is
object to the rule.
ridiculous. You ask me a question, and I am not allowed to answer it.
Do you understand, Mr. Durst? You're not answering the question that I asked you. Do you understand
I
that?
am answering the question. You said Nick Chavin said that I confessed to him after dinner, and I am telling you that after dinner we had no conversation.
So listen to my question. I'm not asking you whether or not the event happened. I'm asking, you're aware that Nick Chavin testified. His version of what occurred is not that you said, I murdered Susan Berman. It's that you said to him, it was either her or me, I had no choice, correct?
So I cannot respond to what you're asking me.
You can answer the question that I'm asking you.
I could answer the question you're asking me, but that would not be a meaningful answer.
Well, I guess that's for myself, the judge, and the jury to decide. So you get to answer the
Well,
question.
I'd like the jury to decide it.
Oh, trust me, they
You
will.
won't let me speak it.
Your Honor, can you advise the witness that he needs to answer the question that,
Your Honor, I want to talk at sidebar
We-
because there's been a lot of stuff going on.
Okay,
I've been sitting
no, please
here.
be seated, Mr. Chesnoff. This is Mr. DeGuerin's role, not yours.
Your Honor, can you
One
advise?
lawyer, otherwise we got 10 lawyers objecting at the same time. Now, you may not engage in colloquy. You may pose questions. They may be difficult questions. You may move to strike if the questions are not answered. But do not get into an argument with the witness directly.
Your
All
Honor,
right,
could-
that's all.
Could the court instruct the witness that he is not to decide what he wants to
Right,
answer?
no, there's a way that it's done. And this is, I will do it the
Thank
way
you, Your
it's
Honor.
done. Mr. Durst, listen carefully to the questions and answer only the question that is presented to you.
I will
All
try
right, a
to do
question?
better.
Pardon?
I will try to do better.
Thank
But
you.
it is very, very, very difficult.
No, I understand that and appreciate that, Mr. Durst, but you
The
must.
deputy district attorney is testifying in his questions.
So leading questions do have that feeling sometimes, and that makes it difficult sometimes to answer those questions. But if the question asks simply for a yes or a no, that is the correct answer. Or I don't know, if you don't know. That's acceptable also. That's my instruction to you now. You may continue, Mr. Lewin.
Mr. Durst, the question I'm asking you is, you are aware that Nick Chavin testified that you said to him, not Bob told me he murdered Susan, but that Bob said it was either her or me, I had no choice. You're aware that's what Nick Chavin testified, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Durst, you're also aware that Nick Chavin specifically testified that he never got a chance and you never said anything about whether or not you had killed Kathy, correct?
Correct.
And it's your position, correct, you've said that Nick Chavin is lying, correct?
Correct.
Can you explain, Mr. Durst, why Nick Chavin would lie and say that you had not exactly confessed to Susan, but made a statement where the inference is you killed her, but then specifically say Bob never confessed to Kathy? Does that make sense?
Objection.
Sustained.
Violation 352.
Wait, what's the grounds, Your Honor?
352, it's argumentative.
Mr. Durst, can you explain if Nick Chavin is, as you say, lying? Do you have an explanation as to why he did not say, yeah, Bob also confessed to killing Kathy?
Nick Chavin also testified that he wanted to get in good with my brother Douglas, and that by lying and saying that I had confessed, that would make Douglas like Nick Chavin a whole lot.
But if that were true, Mr. Durst, wouldn't Nick Chavin have the incentive to say, oh yes, Bob explicitly told me he murdered Susan, and Bob explicitly told me that he killed Kathy, and Bob explicitly told me that he murdered Morris Black?
Argument includes objection.
Overruled.
There was no need to.
What do you mean there was no need to?
Nick Chavin accomplished what he was trying to accomplish by lying and saying that I confessed to killing Susan Berman. I am sure that made Douglas Durst like Nick Chavin a whole lot.
So your testimony is that Nick Chavin is lying and making things up, but he's not lying all the way, he's lying kind of part of it. He could have said more, but what he did was enough. Is that your testimony?
That's argument.
Overruled.
Correct.
It's time for a break. Do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. Return at 10:45. All right, our jurors have left the courtroom. Mr. Chesnow.
Thank you, Your Honor. What I'm about to say isn't meant to be a personal attack, because I understand that Mr. Lewin at times finds Mr. Durst's answers in his mind to be incredible. But as a result, Mr. Lewin may not realize it, but he is making facial expressions, he is laughing, he is looking at the jury when he's laughing, and considering the fact that he is the person that interrogated the witnesses that he's asking Mr. Durst about, we've already talked to the court about how we believe that makes him a witness, and implicitly is kind of vouching for what his witnesses say. So I'm not suggesting that, and marathon of cross-examination, there can be points in time when Mr. Lewin is exasperated and expresses it the way he does, but it also, there are gratuitous comments, which in light of the length and, you know, I don't know what the word is. I don't want to say strength, but he's worked hard and done crosses. That stuff is unnecessary, and I think Mr. Durst, when he hears a question, I think, most respectfully, Your Honor, I think you've been a little quick to strike, because I really think he's trying to explain himself, and that's why he's expressed frustration, and I don't think he really understood that you had stricken it for an evidentiary reason. And so I would ask you, Your Honor, we're not, you know, we're going to have an hour and a half and then another hour, that the court consider the fact that this has been a long and arduous cross, and that and to prevent a long redirect, allowing Mr. Durst to finish his answers would be more in the interest of what we're trying to accomplish here, and probably would prevent some of the back and forth. But again, I understand why Mr. Lewin could he seemed frustrated, but I also understand why Mr. Durst seems frustrated. So I wanted to express that to the record.
All right, thank you, and Mr. Chesnoff, and I would always strike a non-responsive answer, but often the attorney does not request it. When it's requested, it's done. If it's not responsive, I give a little bit of leeway if it doesn't volunteer new information, and need not necessarily be yes or no, but there was some gratuitous commentary, and I admonished you when you did it, Mr. Lewin, and don't do that. I do notice a little chuckle sometimes, and I don't know if I don't think that's intentional. I think it's weird. So anyway, I did want to, we did have a sidebar that wasn't recorded. I think it's important. First sidebar, there's an objection on privilege. I take that very seriously, but here the objection on privilege, attorney-client privilege grounds, was overruled, and that is because those conversations were not privileged, or no longer privileged. The privilege was waived by multiple revelations of the same fact to others in other contexts. Secondly, on the idea of the more objections on questions being argumentative, I overruled objections that questions were argumentative because in each instance the question established a fact, even if there are other effects of the question. If the question establishes a fact, it is probably not argumentative, and was not. The second issue which has arisen because Mr. Durst has admitted lying and admitted a willingness to lie, his motivation and his assessment of where he stands based upon the significance of his admissions then becomes ground for examination. Otherwise, the witness can simply continue to make false statements. So I think to effectively cross-examine it, we have another level. Again, asking a jury if a jury could possibly believe something, there are argumentative questions. I have sustained objections to those, but some objectionable questions did not receive objections, and there's not much I can do. Evidence Code 353 is notable, but I need a correct contemporaneous objection. Further, there was an objection of relevance on Mr. Durst's exercise of rights in Galveston. So the lack of proof in Galveston, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the fact that he exercised his right to trial is not relevant, certainly not. He has every right to do that. But what is relevant is Mr. Durst's credibility. First of all, his attitude about testimony and testifying. Secondly, to any extent that he has manipulated a jury or admitted doing that by rehearsing testimony, getting feedback from a consultant who apparently would be mindful of the likely psychology of the selected jurors. This is relevant, and his consciousness of guilt of the crime also, which still may be proved by a preponderance, though there is reasonable doubt, that also is as a basis for admission of those, and that's why I overruled the objections. I don't think you have anything to, I know you want to say something.
No, just one last thing on what
Yeah.
the court just said. I don't think the court is making a finding that that there is reasonable doubt regarding Galveston. I think what the court, if you look at the words the court just used, the record could take as the court saying that, hey, I'm letting in the Galveston stuff because you've shown by a preponderance, but there is reasonable doubt. We don't believe, although it's not our standard, that there's any even reasonable doubt about Galveston. I want to make sure that's not a finding the court's making.
It's not a finding. I'm just saying there may be the jury had a reasonable doubt as to the charged offense, and he was acquitted, period. And that fact itself is not relevant. Now, we all know that it happened and it had some effects on state of mind. That part could be relevant, but just to be clear.
Yeah, on a matter that we discussed in the back, I showed Mr. Lewin some notes.
We'll do that. We won't do that. We'll do that. Submit that to me. I'll have a look. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Understand. Okay. Recess.